Robin is a graduate of Trinity College Dublin and Cambridge University, where he completed his PhD. He's held research positions at the University of Oxford, Oxford Brookes, and at Trinity. And he's a historian of British and Irish architecture, landscapes, and urban society, 1580 to 1690. He's worked on several major research digital humanities projects and is currently the R.J. Hunter Digital Fellow in History, working on what was the Ulster Settlers Database project, now the People of the Ulster Plantation, right, Mary? Yes, project, yep. Which hosted a major conference on the Ulster Plantation at Prony last Thursday, at which Robin spoke on the project. And that project is run in collaboration with the Royal Irish Academy and with Maynooth University and ourselves here in Queen's. But Robin's own work, which he's going to talk to us about today, his personal research project, focuses on the building projects of Sir Arthur Chichester, and he's published in this field, including the book Protestant Dublin, 1660 to 1760, Architecture and Iconography, in 2012. So it's a great pleasure to have Robin here today to speak about Sir Arthur Chichester and Dublin's official architecture, 1605 to 15.
Right, thank you. Thanks. I was delighted to join the school 2 years ago as research fellow for the People of Plantation Ulster project, whose current development phase ends in March. And work for that meant that longer term research had to go into refrigeration, and I'll outline that research briefly, but only a part of it will get a proper defrosting today. And while preparing a pair of articles on the material culture of the early Stuart episcopate, I recognized that I didn't know enough about elite domiciles built in Ireland between about 1603 and 1641. Although dedicated book length remain lacking, monographs had appeared on set pieces such as Dunluce and Portumna, while older work by Martin Jope, Maurice Craig, and Rolf Loeber had drawn attention to a scattering of great seigneurial houses built after the 9 Years' War. These studies, harnessing fieldwork, measured surveys and inventories, as well as antiquarian observation, proved highly useful and provided a template for how my own contributions might proceed. As it happens, scoping work took me to a building not far from me, Dublin Castle in County Wicklow, constructed in the late 1620s for the lawyer and MP John Hoey. Although reasonably well documented, field appraisal was cut short when, in November of 2021, the building was mostly flattened in a storm and its grounds closed to the public. In terms of both written sources and surviving fabric, the most promising subjects remained the Ulster chateaux created by the English and Scottish servitors and undertakers, whose architectural legacies show clear affinities from models in their makers' home regions. As my own inroad, I settled in the end on Sir Arthur Chichester's Carrickfergus mansion Joymount, built between 1610 and 1618 on the site of the town's friary, and named from Chichester's mentor and early patron, Lord Mountjoy. Although the visual evidence for this lost house is slight, namely a block plan and this vignette from 1685, household accounts, visitor descriptions, and the findings of archaeologists since the 1970s suggested that something could be said about the building's plan form and scale. These seemed to have affinities with English lodges of the period, like New Sherborne, built in the 1590s for Sir Walter Raleigh, or the exquisite Wootton Lodge in Staffordshire, probably designed or overseen by Robert Smithson. It wasn't long before the wider Chichester patrimony became my subjects, however. Belfast Castle, destroyed by fire in 1680, in 1708, is somewhat elusive. Sir George Carew's survey of 1611 states that Chichester built a residential block adjoining a tower house, bringing to mind such plantation castles as Donegal, which does not at all resemble the building recorded in Thomas Phillip's well-known Belfast map of 1685. The discrepancy points to extensive rebuilding. I located a petition from Sir Edward Chichester to Henry Cromwell describing the damage inflicted on the property by Scottish soldiers under General Monro. Dungannon, prestigious because it had been the seat of the O'Neill, was coveted by Chichester. A certificate returned to the Irish Commission in 1622 presents it as a model plantation town with a fortress crowning the hill, overlooking a main street, as clearly indicated in Nicholas Pinara's survey of Ulster defences made in 1724. Much more information for Dungannon has been assembled, though a lot of this needs further digestion and comparative study. My plans for an article or two developed into an ambition for a book, perhaps something short and fizzy, but the richness of the sources pointed to a full dress monograph that I would have to write over a couple of years. In doing this, I've broken a promise to myself. After a PhD and 2 books, I was determined not to carry out further research on early modern Dublin, but work established that during Chichester's decade-long deputyship, the city underwent significant changes to its physical aspect, in large measure due to the chief governor's interventions. It was a courtly city in part, but one which was made retain the traditional ties of its spatial elite. Indeed, it appeared to me that Chichester and his governing circle, especially in the higher echelons of the law, could be sensitive to local interests and even achieve détente after the punitive measures taken against the city's patriciate during the anti-recusant mandates campaign that had threatened a serious rift between a pushy executive and Dublin's moneyed men. It's a neat coincidence that this famous inset view of Dublin from John Speed's Atlas, the Theatre of Empire, appeared in print during Chichester's time in government. It's even more fortuitous that the survey which underpinned the image had been prepared in about 1605, the first substantive year of Chichester's time in office, having been procured for Speed by Attorney General Sir John Davies, whose concerns with the city's internal geography were, as we shall see, shared with Chichester. Map views such as this always present challenges of interpretation through their use of stock symbols and inevitable simplification. John Andrews has established that the picture accurately records Dublin's street plan and the general forms of several of its key monuments, therefore allowing something like a snapshot of the capital at the time when Chichester took the king's sword. We can even trace Chichester's route on that occasion. In line with custom, Chichester was received at Hodgen Green, which is on the right, just forward of Trinity College. It was a collection of orchards, gardens, and pastures, bounded to the north by the river and to the immediate east by Trinity College. Moving down Damas Lane towards the walled city. So the axis moving west. The procession entered a city of inward-looking enclaves, linked by curving streets that followed the lie of the land, and defined by the substantial oak row houses that had been admired by Richard Stanihurst and denigrated by that old Elizabethan servitor and grouch Barnaby Rich, who felt that Bristol did it better. The precincts, sheltered from view by houses, shops and stabling, were the medieval legacy, the closes of Christchurch and beyond the walls St. Patrick's Cathedral, the city Thistle, headquartering the mayor and municipal officials, and the Lord Deputy's own berth, the castle. The latter was a roughly rectangular enclosure with a gatehouse and a moat whose unofficial use as a rubbish dump never ceased to annoy. The castle is just here in the southeastern quarter of the walled city. We know much more about the early 17th century castle than before because of the research consolidated in this volume by Sean Duffy and his team. The contributors stress that the castle was more than a royal or rather vice-regal palace. Prisoners of state inhabited two prisons, one in the gatehouse shared with the Court of Castle Chamber, and the other in a tower at the castle's western extremity. Billeting of soldiers was another function. The governor's retinue included 100 horsemen, their mounts stabled in a number of lean-to buildings that eventually extended out to modern-day Georgia Street. The Mint and Council Chamber squatted below the castle's north curtain wall, where it was absurdly climbed. The walls kept out the fresh air. The business of the Lord Deputy, when not in council, was concentrated in the miscellany of interconnected buildings placed along the castle's south, shown in outline by Speed. So it's these rows just along the bottom here. Aside from the castle, a small structure abutting the wall, it's unlikely that much remained of the original castle of the Plantagenets, aside from the large freestanding hall, which we'll come through shortly. The consolidation of the chapel, presence chamber, and Lord Deputy's rooms, comprising bedchambers and closets, into a single architectural envelope, had been achieved from 1565 by Sir Henry Sidney, giving some sense of uniformity to this jumble. We have no records of the elevations, but its possible appearance is suggested by the works of Penshurst carried out by Sidney simultaneously, while the older structures of the base court were incorporated into outwardly uniform blocks with regular fenestration. We could also look to developments at Warwick Castle as reordered by the Barons Brook, though there are other examples such as Rougemont, Bury, Pomeroy, and Great Fulford, all in Devon. Deferred maintenance at the castle was an ongoing issue, causing the late Elizabethan deputies to pester the Lord Treasurer for subventions or permission to rusticate for the summer months. Sidney favoured Termonfeckin near Drogheda, part of the estate of the Archbishops of Armagh. Sir William Fitzwilliam rented the Dublin Archbishop's Palace at Talla, and Essex pined for the priory at Kilmainham that Sidney had often taken. Lord Mountjoy did spend modest sums of his own money on Dublin Castle's upkeep, while his successor, Sir George Carey, in office for only a few months, ornamented his apartments with his celebrated collection of plate. The correspondence of Sidney at Petworth shows the extent to which a chief governor would have to spend on prerequisite fees, maintenance of a household, and the attire and accoutrements that went with the office. The so-called vice-regal style has been ascribed to Sidney by Kieran Brady and others, noting his outlay on heraldic plates, horse trappings and canopies, meant to project kingly magnificence and therefore the nature of his mandate. John Derrick's much reproduced woodcuts emphasize this proxy kingliness achieved through the various symbols of authority that accompanied the governor on his travels. While Chichester's abilities as a governor were not in doubt, his means were frequently in question, and borrowing in London and through the Dublin stable to support his office ran alongside frequent requests to be relieved from his position and let return to Carrickfergus. More creatively, Chichester suggested to Sir Robert Cecil that the king could appoint him president of Ulster and build for him a magnificent palace at Dungannon, creating a new provincial capital. The furthest Chichester could get was a few months' residence at Howth Castle in 1605 and 1606 as plague ravaged the city. The castle he returned to only reinforced the need to escape. Indeed, on coming back after the famine, it was found that the ceiling of Lady Chichester's bedroom had collapsed, and it didn't help that the Master of Works, Samuel Molyneux, a shady figure, tended to his private clients rather than matters official. The volume of business kept Chichester at the helm, and in the years 1605 to 10, covering the problems of privacy, the mandates policy, the flight of the earls, the O'Doherty rebellion, and the articles of plantation. These ruled out reappointment elsewhere. As it happens, they also required a reconfiguration of the deputy's immediate environment in Dublin. From 1606, we see a nascent court culture emerge. The presence chamber received portraits of the king and queen and a cloth of estate, and the household took in a dancing master who was surely present when the Lord Deputy attended a masque at Rathfarnham Castle. Chichester also kept an Irish harpist, indicating that this performer was no bardic monopoly. Far more drastic was the proposal by Chichester, counselled by Sir John Davies and Sir Edward Brabazon, to come to some reckoning on the use of the castle's vast medieval hall, which filled out much of the western portion of the castle quadrangle. And in the reconstruction now at the Dublinia Visitors Centre, that hall is shown. This was destroyed by fire in 1671 and described in official surveys. It probably resembles the structure surviving at Winchester Castle, shown on the right, which in dimensions and plan seems to largely duplicate what is known about its Dublin counterpart. At this point, we come to the crux of Chichester's role in Dublin's development early in his deputyship, namely where to place the city's superior courts. Since the government of Sir Henry Sidney, the Castle Hall had accommodated the common law courts and Court of Chancery. Yet disconcertingly, the hall's undercroft was a munitions store. Inventories taken there throughout the 1580s and 90s list hundreds of edged weapons, muskets, small caliber artillery pieces, and barrels of black powder. All of this next to a forge. The Keys explosion of 1597, which killed over 100 and demolished several hundred houses, should have been a stark reminder that burning propellant could destroy large areas in a matter of seconds. In 1605, the belated expedient, no doubt prompted by the gunpowder plot, was to rehouse the courts in the unused hospital built by Lord Deputy Carey at Hodgen Green near Trinity College, and that will be a postscript to this paper. Earlier in the same year, the king and the four courts are marked in this plan of 1606. So the hall is in the right, and the courts are placed in each of its corners. In early 1606, the king and Chichester had considered sending these courts to Blackfriars, a dissolved Dominican friary in the north city suburb of Oxmantown. It's number 3 on Speed's map. Previously, in 1541 and 67, this had been granted on a short-term lease to the law officers to create the King's Inns, a society for dining and seasonal residence rather than systematic education in jurisprudence on the model of the London Inns. By 1599, when Blackfriars was repurposed as a victual store, the Inns as a society was moribund. After a brief sojourn in St. Patrick's Cathedral, the courts were now assembled in Blackfriars Hall and Dormitory Block. This, in turn, suggested to Sir James Leigh, Lord Chief Justice, that if a parliament was to sit in Dublin in the near future, Blackfriars could be augmented by parliamentary chambers as a permanent amenity. The estimated cost came to £1,700, and when Parliament was not in session, the courts could use these spaces. There was more to this project than the simple undesirability of convening the courts in the incendiary Castle Hall. The conquest of Gaelic Ireland at the end of the previous reign had opened the whole country to English law. The replacement of native customs of landholding by English-style freeholds and leaseholds, and the 1606 Commission for Defective Titles led to a tidal wave of suits in Chancery, strengthening Dublin's position as what Davies had termed the centre and pinnacle of legal administration. In 1606, again, Chichester boasted to the English Privy Council that with the kingdom in peace and quietness, the law and courts of justice are greatly frequented from all parts, men desirous to settle their estates in certainty, which gives hopes for future obedience. And Chichester, rather than Davies, is credited with the extension of the assizes into the provinces, creating 6 circuits, which he contended would bind the natives to the state by abolishing the arbitrary rule of the Gaelic elite. The law was not only an instrument of practical governance, but a highly visible set of customs and rituals, and as Treasurer Thomas Ridgway argued, deserved better than the open-air gatherings of Gaelic culture. Sartorial reforms were an obvious manifestation of this symbolic dimension of the law. The king commanded that judges in the Dublin courts be dressed exactly like their English equivalents, leaving the disbursements for this attar to Chichester. Legal costume, with its idiosyncratic billowing cuts and strident colouring, was felt in English legal circles to convey the singularity of the profession and its unique place in the mechanisms of just governance. The great jurist Sir Edward Coke described how blue cloth betokened faithfulness, violet signalled incorruptibility, and scarlet is known to all men to be a judicial colour. Tell that to any PhD alumnus. Black predictably betokens gravitas and patience. What is unclear is that Blackfriars, on a site that was swampy, was adequate to this reconfigured ethos of judicial display, or that such a reconsideration of Dublin's official geography was actually desirable. Chichester didn't think so. In a letter sent to Robert Cecil in May of 1606, Sir Edward Brabazon, acting on the Lord Deputy's instructions, stated that the Castle Hall remained very fit, needing only roof repairs. The courts could be entered from a postern gate opened in the castle's western wall. So that's just here. Additionally, for security, the castle courtyard might be subdivided by a wall on a north-south axis, as illustrated in this plan accompanying Brabazon's letter. So the wall is running north-south from the offices to the south of the castle up to the Lord Deputy's residence, and the hall just lies to the right. This wall was supposedly to prevent disorder from spilling into the governor's personal precinct. The plan also places each court in a corner of the hall, and Brabazon indicates that the munitions would be removed to his own house west of the city for a reasonable rent. This offer was declined. The wall went unbuilt, but the presentation of the courts within a city centre capsule does indicate that the ongoing separation of that the proposed separation of the law from the ancient core of Dublin hadn't been favoured. The continuance of the court in Oxmantown would have led to the exodus of suitors' lodgings, officers, and accompanying services during the legal terms, thus disturbing the established concentration of commercial transactions within the city. The courts could no longer squat over an armory, but would not be sent to the hinterlands either. The courts were finally disgorged from Blackfriars in 1608, about a year after Chichester had restored the King's Inns as a legal society. The new berth for the courts was to be in the yard of Christchurch Cathedral, a short walk from the castle, occupying the remains of the claustral buildings of the Augustinian canons, used since the dissolution to house the deanery and College of Vicars Choral. This idea, hatched by Chichester, Davies, and Lay, was an arrangement that seemed to please everyone. In the summer of 1607, the city offered 3,000 labourers to quarry and transport stone, while the cathedral chapter welcomed a rent schedule that would fund the completion of works on Christchurch's Crossing Tower. Retrospective insight comes from a petition for pay by the Dean. The site had suited city and cathedral because it was the citizens' resort and remained situated in the heart of the city. Before looking in some detail at the buildings at Christchurch, overseen by Samuel Molyneux, who was partly remunerated by Dublin Corporation, it's important to summarise the political relationship between the urban elite and the chief governor. Dublin's merchant community had been mostly steadfast in its loyalty to the Crown during the 9 Years' War. Figures such as the Protestant mayor, Nicholas Weston, acted as creditors, and Weston sought to dispel rumours that some had traded with the Earl of Tyrone, such as himself. But Weston, in his embrace of Protestantism, was atypical. Dublin Corporation and its constituent guilds were wholly recusant, but unlike Waterford's and Cork's, they did not attempt to seize and Catholicize places of worship following the death of Elizabeth I. Chichester would put this loyalty to the test. The mandate's policy, begun in 1605, commanded that members of Dublin's Board of Aldermen, numbering 24, should attend the Lord Deputy at Sunday service in Christchurch. Defaulters were fined or imprisonment or both. The campaign also threatens the city's jealously guarded sovereignty by forcing the city magistrates to elect religiously compliant mayors without consideration to the traditional succession based on seniority. Cecil and the English Privy Council encouraged moderation when the panic around the gunpowder plot began to pall, causing Chichester to release most of the incarcerated or reduce their fines. This, at face value, this show of force seemed to have worked. By late 1607, hitherto Catholic aldermen complied with the order to receive the Lord Deputy at the cathedral. The other breach in the relationship was financial, whereby the administration enacting royal policy, sought to implement a centralized system of revenue collection by patentees. English searchers were appointed to Dublin ports, and at a legal conference in Holborn, Davies argued that the chartered rights of the Irish ports had no basis in the law of an English monarchy, in the law of monarchy. Despite taking a suit against the city in King's Bench, the government was able to effect something like an accommodation. Dublin freemen, with those of Waterford and Drogheda, would be absolved of poundage dues, and arrears from uncollected customs would revert to the towns. Chichester's conduct in this affair suggests a willingness to protect Dublin's civic institutions from degradation, giving personal support to the city's recorder, Sir Richard Bolton, who was attending a fiscal conference at Whitehall, for which Chichester was rewarded with a cargo of Spanish wines. As John McAvitt has shown, the Lord Deputy's principal concern had been religion, and with this matter resolved, however superficially, he could adopt a more magnanimous stance towards the city. This is the context, I think, for the decision to maintain the courts in Dublin's geographical centre rather than shift them out to its peripheries. Official impunity could be made chime with local attachments. Under the supervision of Samuel Molyneux, the courts were lodged in the residential and collegiate buildings on sloping ground to the south of Christchurch. Everything that had been there, apart from the, I think that the calefactory has been obliterated by a labyrinth, which was a collaboration between the cathedral chapter and Dublin City Council. The old cloister garth had been enclosed on two sides by freestanding cloister alleys, which are shown just here. The refectory lying to the south lodged chancery. This and the prior's house on the west featured an integrated loggia enabling ongoing circulation. Exchequer was further to the south. Common Pleas was wedged into half the cloister garth and was Molyneux's only entire new building at the complex. So this is the cloister garth or garden. Molyneux inserted Common Pleas in a new garden, which is just adjoining King's Bench and could be entered via the cloister. The slant of the sites meant that the courts were distributed over a labyrinth of undercrofts, and the floors of the courtrooms varied in height. An early 17th century description refers to the dizzying ascent from Chancery to King's Bench, which included 4 changes of altitude and around 30 steps. The plan was roughly cruciform, and Luke Jernan mentions how the courtrooms inhabited the terminals of each arm of the cross. That's a survey of the port of the Liberty of Christchurch from 1761, and that the contours have been re-strengthened. This section here is the forecourts as inserted by Samuel Molyneux. What it doesn't convey is the slanting, quite dramatic character of the site. Although reordered by William Robinson, the Surveyor General, in the 1690s, Molyneux's plan, as mentioned, endured and is visible in 18th century surveys. Vestiges of the lobby can be seen in a number of illustrations made after 1800. So this is from a London newspaper. The 3 of the courts are shown. C at the end, I believe, is Chancery. I don't know what the others are, but another is entered from here, and D is the exit to the west end of the cathedral. And the floor of the lobby is shown here at about About 20 years after demolition of the 17th century courts had begun, and there is a larger visual archive which indicates that the Molyneux work survived for close to 2 centuries. Sir William Brereton, a magistrate and landowner from Cheshire, visited the courts in 1635 and found the chambers were conveniently framed and contrived, but regretted that it was difficult to observe the courts in session. And we get an idea of what Brereton was getting at, looking at this view of Chancery and King's Bench in Westminster Hall, where furnishings alone designate court space rather than the architectural envelope. Here, suitors, foreign intelligencers, hawkers, and the merely curious could roam at will. The bid to rehouse the courts did raise the question about what to do with Blackfriars. Colin Kenny opines that the judges used their sojourn to consider a revival of King's Inn and passed this on to Chichester. As before, it would be a place for boarding and dining rather than an educational establishment. And the idea here may have come again from Sir James Leigh and was certainly implemented by Chichester. The position of the revived inns in a distinctive suburban enclave would likely have intensified the corporate identity of the kingdom's law officers, with a common hall and a clear boundary condition, much like the London inns in Holborn, from which Ireland's judiciary largely came following a ban on Catholic judges in 1607. The regrant of Blackfriars named to Sir John Davies points to the enduring monastic character of the building stock, but also its dereliction. It identifies a ruinous chapel, a refectory, an overgrown cemetery, garden, orchards, and an enclosing wall. Excavations in 1984 uncovered a sluice gate and channel, as well as traces of an undercroft with carved stone. Entries in the inn's Black Book from 1608 refer to the repair of the refectory with a dais and wainscoting, plus chimneys and glazing. Funds for this came from the admissions fees of the 99 fellows admitted down to 1609, which had been vetted by Leigh, Chichester, Sir Nicholas Walsh, Chief Justice of the Common Pleas, and Sir Humphrey Winch, Baron of the Exchequer. The chambers were built by the fellows themselves, resulting in slow incremental development of the inn's courtyard. This numbered 18th century plan is appended to a list of fellows going back to about 1610. It mentions 2 attorneys who built an entire range of chambers, it's not known which, with the intention of subletting. The inn's archive also gives further information about the setting. The southern block to the river, just here, number 6, had an arcaded loggia, possibly a survival from the friary. To the east of the inns, which is B on the map, was a large garden with surrounding terrace paid for by Sir Richard Boyle. This is consonant with the landscape situation of the London inns. Stowe's survey says that Gray's had as its chief ornament its spacious garden with curious walks, as well as those that are shaded by lofty trees. Since King's Inns had no student population, the revels or dramatic performances of London's inns may not have had an Irish counterpart, and nothing of the kind is mentioned in the inn's archive. More research may be needed here. In any case, the actual business of the law, in the sense of ceremonious deliberation, was nestled in the curtilage of Christchurch. The inns, as revived by Chichester, therefore did not catalyse extramural settlement and commercial expansion to the north bank of the city. For decades to come, the decisions and perhaps fudges of Chichester and his circle upheld Dublin's status quo. When Lord Deputy Wentworth sought to move the courts back to Oxmantown in the 1630s, he faced fervent opposition. The main act of Chichester's deputyship in its final stage was, of course, the Parliament of 1613 to 15, involving something like the stagecraft of Sir Henry Sidney. The origins, proceedings, and outcomes of this part have been analysed by Coleman, Dennehy, the late Breed McGrath, and John McCavitt, and reiterating them in full is, I hope, unnecessary. Briefly, the core themes are the controversy caused by the erection of new boroughs, the fracas over the elections of the Common Speaker, and a legislative programme covering plantation, infrastructure like bridges, and acts of piety or the poor law. The first practical consideration about Parliament was its venue. Early Tudor parliaments had been nomadic, that of 1541 assembling at Limerick and Trim, and Parliament of 1636 moved between Limerick, Cashel and Kilkenny. The sole Marian Parliament, however, sat in Dublin, where Elizabeth's first Parliament also convened at Christchurch. In 1612, Chichester told Davies that the hall at Dublin Castle could accommodate the Commons and the Lords could go to the Deputies' presence chamber. In the end, both houses sat in the hall, which was recorded in contour for the final time in a survey of the 1670s, which records the outline of the hall that had been destroyed 2 years before. And according to Toby Barnard, the culprit in that case had been a mouse carrying a candle. This choice of venue aroused anxieties about the munitions store beneath, with 10 of the Catholic peers making sundry exceptions to this arrangement, which included the guard of 100 soldiers sentrying the building. An account of the 1613 sitting preserved in the Irish College in Rome complains that MPs and peers were herded into the hall like animals facing the butcher's axe. Preparation of the hall once again fell to Samuel Molyneux, who plundered the ruined priory at Kilmainham for roofing materials. Furnishing was the responsibility of the Sergeant at Arms, who was also a bodyguard to the Lord Chancellor, jailer for Parliament, and its mace bearer. The plan of the hall's temporary fixtures can only be fathomed from references to movements of MPs and Lords during divisions and the formation of committees. McGrath's analysis of such references makes it clear that the houses were placed in rectangular enclosures in the central volume of the hall, fleeing up the aisles for offices and lobbies. The houses didn't touch one another as committees met in a middle room between the chambers. So one has to visualize the two houses spaced apart on the central axis of the hall, with a lobby lying in the center, and a drawn reconstruction would probably be an idea. The plan of each House of Parliament was modelled on Westminster's, as adumbrated in John Hooker's treatise on an ideal legislature, included in the 1587 edition of Holinshed's Chronicles. The Dublin House of Lords comprised horizontally opposed benches for the bishops and lay peers, plus woolsacks for the law lords in the central row. The Commons, as described by Hooker, were likened to a theatre. Dublin's had 4 rows of benches convening on the Speaker's seat in the centre. Dockets from the royal wardrobe give considerable detail about the Lords. It was a sumptuous affair. Peers entering the room paid obeisance to the cloth of estate. An exquisite heraldic drapery of crimson and purple velvet with gold embroidery. Perhaps it resembles this one from Great Yarmouth municipality. The Lord Deputy's chair had damask cushions fringed in gold lace, and his parliamentary robe was crimson lined with ermine. The colours and materials are reminiscent of those deployed in Sydney's parliaments, but these were probably not the reference point, as in 1612, the Ulster King of Arms and his deputy, the Athlone Pursuivant, were dispatched to Westminster to study ritual protocol. In the Dublin sessions, these professional heralds and pageant masters were the most conspicuous officers of state after the Lord Deputy and Commons Speaker. They were attired in surcoats with the royal arms, a design that, it seems, did not evolve between the later Middle Ages and the merging of Ulster's office with the English Norroy in 1923. Questions of aristocratic precedence were normally Ulster's prerogative, but Chichester insisted that he adjudicate these on his own. 8 peers questioned their precedence relative to the recently ennobled, and the most vocal of them, Viscount Gormanston, refused to sit at all until the matter was decided. He also refused to attend the opening sermon by Archbishop Hampton on Mark 12:17, or render unto Caesar, surely a plea for compliance. The sermon was delivered at St. Patrick's Cathedral. For Sydney's parliaments, the cavalcade had halted at Christchurch Cathedral, so the Castle Hall is here. Its convenience to the castle is readily indicated in city plans. Moreover, Christchurch was unquestionably the senior of Dublin's 2 cathedrals. In 1614, Chichester placed a monument in its choir commemorating his son Arthur, who had died at the age of 6 months in 1606. The cathedral's condition may not have been the deterrent, as by 1613 the crossing works were complete and its tower was close to completion, and that's the tower still at Christchurch. McGrath contends that the city's second extramural cathedral, so down here, about a kilometre from the castle, was chosen because it gave greater prominence to the procession. During this, Chichester was preceded by the King's Sword and Cap of Maintenance, and followed by the Lord Spiritual and the richly liveried peers, their garb vetted by the personnel of Ulster's office. The longer route to St. Patrick's gave the opportunity then for presenting the state to a much larger audience. Christchurch was also smaller, whereas St. Patrick's Cathedral was usually described by English travellers as much more substantial in scale. By progressing there, Chichester could weave castle and city into a wider symbolic topography. Still, the choreography of Parliament did not correct the castle's ongoing inadequacy as a suitable relevance for the chief governor, so a brief postscript is necessary. From summer of 1613, Chichester's correspondence was signed as from Chichester House. This building on Hodgen Green had been adapted from Sir George Carey's stalled hospital. It could be the subject of another paper. Chichester bought out Carey's city lease and acquired additional yardage to extend the grounds along the Liffey shoreline. So this is Carey's hospital, and this is it as reported in a city survey from the 1680s. He and Lady Chichester hired joiners and upholsterers to assist with conversion from redundant building to suburban mansion. The juggling of the property following Chichester's death in 1625, though it had been left to his brother Edward, means an ample lease record, and these documents give some indication as to its plan. The house was 70 feet long, of 2 stories, and featured a terraced walk to one side, leading to a further walk along the river embankment, rather like the great Strand palaces of London, which were similarly situated. The house's western limb had a large room, plus a staircase attached to its high end, and it was here from 1660 that the Irish House of Commons met. So it is likely in this consolidated lease map made after the demolition of Chichester House, the House of Commons had been placed in a large chamber just here. The Great Chamber, by custom, above the hall, also became the Restoration era House of Lords. The eastern part must have housed parlours and over them the gallery and multiple chambers, which are mentioned in the leases. In due course, I'll come up with schematic plans and perhaps elevations, because at least to my eyes, the drawing on the right looks like a suburban bungalow. Such was the key place of business for the remainder of Chichester's stint in office. Its surroundings were reshaped by official edict. Chichester ordered that the Bridewell on Hodgen Green, inaugurated in 1604, be let to Trinity College as a boarding house. The Green's rubbish dumps were to be carted away. Dung pits were to be covered with earth. Animal pens were to be located to St. Stephen's Green. Causeway-type paths covering over Hodgen Green, a marshy area, were redrawn along straight lines. By the river, offal dumping, which accumulated in a minor inlet just below Chichester's garden, was forbidden by the city corporation. Chichester House brought about no real rezoning of the city, but consolidated an existing roadway from the estuary to the walled city. A scattering of freestanding mansions were built in the 1620s and 30s. Toby Caulfield and James Usher acquired plots and constructed residences held in lease from a compliant city council. We may get glimpses of these in landscape tableaux of the 18th century, such as Francis Wheatley's famous view of the Volunteers and College Green on the right, and Joseph Tudor's view from the front of Trinity College looking towards the city. But by then, Chichester House itself was long gone. Demolished in 1727, it yielded to Edward Lovett Pearce's monumental Parliament House. This plan of Chichester House hung in Speaker Connolly's office, as if to emphasize the contrast between old and new. The plan is absolute bunk. Its subdivisions are a total variance from the written record, and it's incomprehensible how both Houses of Parliament, incorrectly shown as being on the same or ground floor, can have only been lit from their short ends. Knowledge of Chichester's urban interventions are not always easy to come by, but some clarity, I think, has emerged in the near future. These findings will become part of a larger and hopefully worthwhile study of a governor and a milieu that exercise some skill in adapting and augmenting their physical environment rather than seeking to systematically reinvent it. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. If no other takeaway, we will note to beware of mice bearing lit candles in future. Okay, so we can take questions from people in the room and also people online. Just raise your hand digitally or type a question into the text box. But let's start with the room. Who would like to begin the questions? Sean.
Very interesting construction, very limited materials.
Okay.
What I was wondering about was the public of this aimed at.
The
public that all this display is aimed at.
Yep.
Because you've got two groups in Dublin.
Mm-hmm.
You've got no English elite.
Yep.
Many of whom presumably are very familiar with the current architectural styles in English.
Mm-hmm.
And you have an old English elite.
Yep.
Whose frame of reference would presumably have been, whatever, Irish tradition,
Yep.
Are there two different, is there a clash of cultures there, or are they all working within the same architectural frame of reference?
I think architecturally speaking, there is a shared cultural horizon in that the aesthetic sort is ultimately English. but that doesn't preclude Europe. And that's a dimension I do need to work into the analysis as well. And if one reverted to the country house, for example, the template is very clearly English, and when tower houses receive a residential block, these are no longer open halls, but have suites of rooms with a great chamber overhaul and a stair at the high end. Ultimately, the plan they're calling on would be the English home counties. It is a question that needs further thought. I don't know if that's a satisfactory answer, but I think yeah.
Then goes to is there a Scottish influence?
I think in Dublin that would be less likely.
Yeah.
It may be present, but I suspect not really. I suspect not really. I would seek that ultimately in Ulster. The urbanism of towns such as Newton Ards and its ornamentation clearly points to well-established Scottish typologies such as the market cross and the toll booth. But in Dublin, it's a different type of urbanism, but it is within the inherited medieval envelope.
Mary.
Just two questions following on from John's question. Do we know anything about the architects? I mean, you're assigning a lot of Chichester himself.
Yep.
I mean, he wasn't sitting down drawing
Nope.
designs.
Mm-hmm.
So do we know who was actually doing that? Was there any reference to?
Okay.
I don't know. No, obviously, we know who designed the new parliament.
Mm-hmm. It is extremely difficult to put the name of an overseer to a project. For the work I carried out for the settlers database, I've been noting along the way artificers, and we can probably name about 100 of them active in Ulster between about 1605 and 1641, and many of those are Scots. So brick burners, masons, carpenters, joiners, nail makers are identified, and Robert Hunter had followed up some of these in the papers of the London livery companies. And for overseers, Samuel Molyneux's name does come up, and it's possible that one of the mansions built in North Wexford around 1620 is by him. He may also be responsible for the lost great house in Charlemont Fort, which resembles the Wexford house. And the other figure is Humphrey Farnham, studied by McGrath and Loeber, who did carry out some repairs on the castle and worked in for projects such as bridges. But tying a name to a project, for example, Chichester House, that really hasn't gotten very far, and I think it's not even at the point of power of suggestion.
Materials.
Yep. Mhm. Yeah.
Which will really enhance the sort of history of the material culture.
Yep.
As being more or less ignored. The other thing, just for my own interest, I was wondering about, you say, Christchurch is the senior cathedral.
St. Patrick's is the spare part, which went from collegiate church to cathedral to something like dissolution and became a cathedral again under Archbishop Loftus. It has its utilities in that it has a parish church, St. Nicholas, without it has a dean and chapter and all of the trappings of a cathedral, but the diocesan is Christchurch.
The ecclesiastical.
Yep. 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 In the aisle. Yep. Yep. It's in the I think the north aisle of St. Patrick's. Yeah. Yeah.
case and that
It's proximal to the Archbishop's Palace. Saint Sepulchre's, which is later Kevin Street Barracks, which is now being denuded of later accretions. Yep. I suspect convenience and the devotional space of these cathedrals is the chancel rather than the nave. And at Christchurch, it's the very long, slightly kinked choir that was their cathedral, whereas the nave could be populated at times by hawkers and sightseers, and rents were paid over the tomb of Strongbow. That's very common practice in Scotland and England, using such monuments. But ultimately, the cathedral and chapel royal are the chancel at Christchurch, and at St. Patrick's. It seems that the nave is it's not redundant, but it is somewhat closed off from the crossing and the long and the choir.
Are made aware of that. So the narrative was the executive of the web had to go to St. Patrick's. So there must have been people
Oh yeah, absolutely.
finding it out all the time, yeah.
Okay.
It's not really about the architecture, more about the functionality of Christchurch when all the signboards appear there, or if it's reconfigured.
Yep.
I mean, perhaps your research has concentrated on plans, but is there any evidence of the interaction between the canons, the ecclesiastical authority, and the civil authority, and how they
It's interesting question. I've not come across evidence for the cathedral chapter having much to do with the courts, well nestled in the cathedral close, and the cathedral close was an intensely commercial space as well, and its labyrinthine site and history has been much gone over by Stuart Kinslett with his Trinity PhD largely on this, and I don't recall picking up much about the again the chapter on the courts crossing paths very much. I imagine that the dean and chapter were glad to be in receipt of rents. Yep.
it's a bit like a site for purpose.
Yes, indeed. Yeah.
Any questions online?
Yes.
Yes.
Carl Lucy says, I'm slightly alarmed that the plan of Chichester House with Lords and Commons on axis has been roundly debunked. And can you shed light on the spatial arrangement operated by Parliament?
Yeah. Well, but first, greetings to Connor. Okay, the releases from the late 1620s running until the 70s, when outright purchase of Chichester House is made by the government. Prior to that, 3/4 of it had been owned by John Parry, the Bishop of Ossory, and prior to that in multiple subleases from the city. So there is a very ample paper trail, and it took a lot of effort to make sense of it. But what I hoped deciphered is that the Houses of Parliament occupied this side of the house, and that the Commons chamber was entered from a screens passage at its low end. So if we contend that this much was the Commons, stairs, or great stairs, always go at the high end of a hall, so we could position them somewhere here, and a lobby and a secondary staircase about there. The House of Lords went in the Great Chamber, and again by custom the Great Chamber goes over the hall. So Parliament's patrimony, as it were, is this side of Chichester House, but there's surely ample space remaining for offices and so forth. And a drawn reconstruction is something I do need to produce at some point. It would bring some visual clarification. In 1660, around £1,000 was spent preparing Chichester House for Parliament, and a lot of that is furnishing and upholstery. But it included a house of office, a latrine, and stabling for something like 50 horses, and that's a major project. So from the Restoration period on, what had been Carey's Hospital is acquiring annexes, and that's its state down to its ultimate loss in 1727. The plan from the Gough collection simply doesn't correspond to the lease material, and even by pondering the displacement of the parliamentary chambers, it's neat to have them horizontally opposed. But otherwise, they just don't make sense, because there would be no natural light coming into the Commons chamber shown here on the ground floor, except at its narrow end. And because this is on the ground floor, there's no lantern running above it. So as Connor suggested, the 1727 plan is one really not to take at face value. And I think its purpose was really commemorative. It could be contrasted with the lucid plan and monumentality of the new Parliament House, and the deteriorating mess that had been inherited. And when John Dunton, the English bookseller, visits Dublin in the late 1690s, he said that Chichester House was an old building with nothing interesting in it. I guess tastes vary, but it was felt to be old hat by the end of the 17th century. And the reports by Thomas Burr, which will be familiar to Connor, they're printed in the Commons Journal, say that the masonry walls of Chichester House are bowing outwards, and the roof plates, where the roof carpentry meets the wall, are rotten through, and in fact it's borderline dangerous. So again, I think that this is rhetorical rather than an archaeologically accurate recording of what the Parliament chamber had been about. So answering the question, I think yes, we can get some sense of Chichester House's plan when it had been the early Stuart's Parliament House.
The older map you have of the building, that you said looked like a bungalow.
Oh, that's the city survey map. Yeah.
Yeah. Is that, do you think that's a hospital building, or hospital St. Lamb's has looked like? Or did Chichester make so many changes that you can't link the two?
The Almshouse plan, looking say at Kilkenny or Fethard, would be cellular, so a central corridor with rooms for the members to either side. But at Kilkenny, you're left with a masonry shell, so these have been joinery partitions, and I see no reason why Carey's Hospital would have been much different. So yeah, so yeah.
I think it's 6.
Yeah. So yeah, so I would think that Chichester had to work with an envelope that had very little in it. Certainly had some partition walls, but to create the whole chamber, screens, passage, and parlours, he's going to have to construct quite a bit. Surveys such as these are always very cursory, because what they're concerned with is the dimensions of plots. It's very peculiar. Yeah. Considering that Chichester House was regarded by Sir Arthur and Lady Chichester as quite lavish, The images such as these really don't do it justice. But Speed, or rather, the cartographer hired by Davies, thought that Carey's Hospital was significant enough to include it on the map on some scale as well. Yeah, look, number 10 on the map.
That is more or less your book.
Yeah, a row type structure.
Yeah.
Can I ask you, Robin, is there any significant construction associated with Trinity College at this time? Still obviously very new institution, or is it just using adapted monastic buildings, or is there new build going on that site as well, which would be very close
Yeah,
to
the
Chichester House?
the tower from the Augustinian Priory remained until I think 1699, which is very late. But the quadrangle, internally brick, externally stone, was largely complete by 1594, and then in the 1620s, the Quests, I forget who, buy a further L-shaped residential range to the north. And from that point on, Trinity is growing. It's often thought that nothing survives of the Elizabethan college, but the recent archaeology has shown that that's not the case. And in as far back as Fellows Square, brick undercrofts have been found, and they've been backfilled pending future investigation. But to do a licensed dig in this country, there has to be a development. And that discovery was made because fiber optic cables were being laid. So there had to be archaeological monitoring. I'm not holding out for a comprehensive survey of TCD any time soon, but there is enough to discern its growth stages. And the famous view at Hatfield House gives an axonometric view of the college, with a knot garden that's probably too good to be true, and caryatid figures flanking the door case. But the architecture proper does correspond to what's described in the college muniments and in the correspondence of Walter Travers, the first provost. It is probably high time that someone wrote at length about the early buildings of Trinity College, and the recent book about them concerns the residential buildings only, and the chapel's not covered. We have quite a good bit of information from the college archives about that chapel, and the effigy of Luke Challoner, recently rediscovered in the undercroft of the Georgian current chapel, and in an absolutely miserable state because it had been outdoors for so long, and the alabaster has largely dissolved. But it does correspond to a drawing made by Thomas Deneely in the 1580s. But so the monasticness of Trinity endured in the form of the tower, which was also an extra porter's lodge. And quite surprising that it survived for so long. And there are references to it in the archives to students using it to smuggle in piglets and other small animals that they cooked in their rooms.
And this must be another rationale for this cleaning up of Hodgin Green that you'd be talking about. Obviously, Chichester, but it's his new front garden, so to speak. So he has a desire for that, but this connection with the new institution at Trinity as well must be part of that.
And Trinity itself doesn't catalyze development at this end of Dublin. It's marshland. And there were timber causeways running over it in seemingly random directions, and the River Stane cuts in front of Trinity that was bridged over. Chichester House is east of the city, even though Dublin's winds are providing from the west, blowing all that pollution out of what could have been a hospital quarter in Carey's day. And Chichester House itself doesn't prompt a great deal of building. There are freestanding mansions. And there is in fact a drawing of James Usher's built in the early 1630s, but I didn't include it today.
Thank you. Any other questions? For Robin, anything else online? No? Okay. Well, look, thank you all very much for coming, and thanks particularly to Robin for coming again after having put so much work into last Thursday's conference and presenting on his work at Arthur Chichester. We look forward to coming to completion and
Yeah, thank you.
publication. Thank you. Yeah. Thanks. Okay, thanks very much. So we have a seminar next Monday at 4:30 in this room. It will be, I've forgotten what it is. It's archaeology. Paddy Gleason talking about his new book on royal assembly places in early medieval Ireland, Tara, etc. So that's what we'll have next Monday at 4:30. So if that's of interest, please come along.